Hi, everyone. Welcome to this week's episode of Navigating Now. So excited to have you. As you can tell, I am not Anthony. My name is Anjana Raj. I'm really excited to be back in the hot seat this week to talk about DEI. Um, and so now today's episode, which we'll get into, but I want to introduce our guest, Dr. Harriet Lewis. She and I will be talking about right-sizing impactful DEI for your organization, big or small. Dr. Harriet Lewis is the founder and principal consultant of Konesens Development. Konesens is committed to fostering inclusive strategies that further economic development, regional and global trade, and increased tourism and sustainable peace. Thank you so much, Dr. Harriet, for joining us.
Thank you. I'm excited to be here.
Do you want to talk a little bit about what you do at Connoisseur and the impact that you're having?
Yeah, absolutely. So thank you for that introduction. As you mentioned, we focus on DEI, CSR training and support, international trade and tourism development. And Konesens Development emerged out of Konesens Research, which may seem kind of weird, the three different areas. With Konesens Research, we focused on market research, online panel development. And then, this was back in 2005, 2006. And many developing countries, tourism was seen as a panacea to furthering economic development in marginalized countries, emerging economies, as well as eradicating, reducing poverty. And so that's how we got involved in tourism research. And so when I formed Konesens Development, I can't continue with that. And so it seems a little bit different from Konesens when we think about DEI, but it's definitely connected because we're talking about furthering inclusion and equity domestically and globally. And so that's the kind of impact that we focus on domestically and globally, creating opportunities for marginalized populations everywhere.
Sorry, there was a truck going, so I wanted to make sure I'm mindful of that. Thank you so much for sharing. I think that's really cool that you were able to not just look at marginalized communities domestically, but also internationally as like Americans. How are we interacting with communities outside the US? Very cool. Today, we want to talk about, DEI initiatives for the organization, whether that is, a small business or a startup. Oftentimes, when you're a small group or a small team, we're often strapped for capital and resources, but still want to prioritize DEI initiatives. And, it's important, a value for the organization. What do you recommend or suggest that, where organizations start or what they can do to prioritize DEI for their organization?
Yeah, so, I have this conversation with companies on a regular basis, almost daily, because we focus specifically on small companies, and companies are different stages of understanding. Different CEOs or HR directors are different stages of what they want to do. In addition to resources, but there are many things that companies do, and one of the things that many companies have started doing since within this pandemic have been, reading a lot, developing book clubs. They've been doing that. Some companies have been doing that, or they're beginning to think about doing that. Other things that they're doing is really, just trying to take a pulse, depending on the diversity and inclusion of the company. That's something that we recommend, but some companies are not, as diverse as we would like them to be, but they're wanting to do something. They're wanting to have some level of impact. And so one of the things that I've been doing personally with many of the leadership at some of these companies I've been providing individual coaching either to the CEO or to their senior staff to help them think through what that plan can be long term. It may include some type of survey, or it may involve some other initiative. But those are some things that when you don't have the resources, which most companies don't have the resources, they're not Fortune 500 companies, don't have the resources to invest in a DEI director or DEI, C-suite person. Oftentimes, the DEI person is either a person of color or a person that's of a diverse, quote unquote, diverse population within that company, or it's the HR person, the HR person who's handling payroll and everything else. And so we have to think outside the box of how can we create an inclusive environment that furthers the objectives, but also doesn't break the bank with a company that may not have the resources as many other companies may have.
Right. When we, do you suggest that it happens at the top in leadership, or is that something that, leadership pushes for everyone to participate across the organization? Is that something everybody can march towards together, or leadership started off?
Yeah, from my experience, leadership has to buy in. Leadership, they may not lead it, but they definitely have to put their stamp of approval on it. And we've seen the studies that, if it's something that's mandated, if it's a training that's mandated, people are not going to give their all. But what I've also seen that if it's not mandated, most people will not attend. And then what you have, people who are attending the sessions are individuals that typically attend diversity training. So you have people who are already reading books, people who are already listening and watching the podcast,
self-selecting,
who are wanting to work on themselves. So I think, the workplace is an opportunity for people to connect to people who are different than themselves. It's the one place where people who would typically live in not so diverse communities or come from not so diverse households, it is the one place where they can experience diversity. And so this is where HR directors and CEOs have an opportunity to be social change agents. So in addition to the CEO leading that effort, in some ways, it needs to be incentivized, I think. If not mandated, definitely incentivized for people for the company to really experience the full effect.
Yeah, that makes sense. In my previous employers, there were a lot of engagement organizations within the company, like, diversity engagement organizations, employee engagement organizations. And I was a part of one that was for women in technology. And a lot of people were under the impression that if you're a man, you can't attend, right? But the women already understand the plight of women. So how do we engage people who maybe feel like, oh, this resource isn't for me? How do we make sure they're also at the table learning and engaging and listening?
I think that companies need to have both and I do many companies have these ERGs, employee resource groups, where it's specifically, the Latinx ERG or the African American ERG or the woman ERG, LGBTQI ERG. But even though typically these ERGs are designed for these communities, these groups of people to move either to create a safe space for people to connect and to share, but also to create an opportunity for people to think through what the company needs. When we're talking about beyond the sharing of a shared experience, at a company, when we're talking about coming up with ideas to further policy, to influence culture within a company, you have to have people outside that community. You need to have, and these people who are outside the community, these people are your allies. These people are your sponsor. We hear people talking about, how can I be an ally? What is an effective ally? An effective ally are those people who are outside of those communities, men who are participating in the women ERG or Latinx, participating in African American or white employees participating in Asian American groups. And so this is definitely necessary as it relates to moving initiatives further within a company.
Yes, couldn't agree more.
And creating relationships for mentorship and for sponsorship, which is absolutely important.
Yeah, I mean, creating like a culturally diverse work environment is beneficial for everyone, not just the people in the marginalized communities, right? Yeah.
Absolutely.
I want to touch on the allyship portion that you mentioned. What can allies, I think there's a lot of like, no one's at the finish line. So there's always learning that's happening, no matter what community you belong to. How can allies make a better, more conducive, safer environment to feel like they can learn and support the people in the communities they want to be supporting?
Well, listen oftentimes, and I think people are listening more. People are trying to listen more. And I think in the past, people who would define themselves as allies would not listen. Typically, people would know already what a particular community needs, and these people, in many spaces, were not necessarily allies. But I think now we have an opportunity to be better allies to each other, and listening. Listening is one way of being an ally. Sharing that you don't know when you don't know, asking for grace when you do make a mistake, and then also speaking up.
Mm-hmm.
Speaking up in times where, too often we see marginalized, when I say these, I don't like to use the word marginalized all the time, but groups.
Yeah. What is the proper term that would be better, a descriptor?
The actual label, quote unquote label, that we put on a group, as opposed to saying marginalized groups. When we talk about, Black women or Latinx women or Asian American men, we need to specifically speak about the specific population as opposed to grouping, within this unknown,
Yeah.
marginalized people, the disenfranchised people. But actually, speaking about, people who may not have the most opportunities in a company, when you see that people that are in the senior leadership or executive leadership in the company is not as diverse as it used to be, one effective way of being an ally is speaking about people that don't have the opportunity, that people, we all have blind spots. Leadership, we all in leadership have blind spots. Sometimes we see one person and they did one great thing and we're focused on elevating them, to the highest ranks, missing out on 4 or 5 other people. And so when we know that people do not see the others that in the workplace that are also that also have the skill set and the motivation and the aspiration for those opportunities, we need to speak about them when they're not around.
Yeah. And I think there's, definitely, as a woman of color in the workplace, there's this I guess perception of, oh, I am a marginalized, individual, but also stepping into that I do have, privileges that I have, and then others might have different privileges and different ways of that their life is advantageous or not advantageous. So I think solidarity in the workplace is super important. Amongst women, amongst people of color, and amongst any kind of subgroup, right? How do we cross pollinate those kind of identities and say that we can show up for each other, even though your experience might be very different from mine, and I have my own kind of set of things that I'm working through?
So this is, let's go here for a minute because
Sure.
This is something that, that we don't talk about. We don't talk about this in the workplace enough. That education and biases and understanding, cross-cultural education is something that we all need for all populations. So when you talk about how can other people of color connect with other people of color, how can we, operate in solidarity, there also has to be this level of openness to understanding, to training, to learning, to reading. So when in this space that we're in right now of DEI, a lot of non-people of color are reading books about, people of color, about justice, but we all need to be reading books about each other in order to operate in solidarity and inclusion and equity for everyone.
Right. Yeah. And I think, as we're so caught up in the narratives that feel closer to our own experiences, so that I've been better and, trying to learn more about kind of just the civil rights movement and the social justice movement in the US, because even though I am not, of Black descent, I still have a lot of benefits that from the movement that happened, in the 70s and 60s that I directly benefit from. So as someone who's South Asian, I think about my community. How are we showing up for people who are not South Asian, right? And I think there's a little bit of this echo chamber of, well, we need to fix what's wrong within the South Asian community. And I mean, all communities have some things that we all need to be fixing at the same time. So I think reading is a great start. I think exposure is a great start. Listening. I think what sometimes people don't think about is just conversations and the openness and conversations like the one that we're having right now. What is something that you wish that people brought into conversations that might make them uncomfortable, that might push their boundaries of what they feel is right or wrong, or their image of their own community?
I wish that people were honest with themselves about their own personal biases that they may have about other groups of people, whatever the range of, the dimensions of diversity may be, that they have these biases and acknowledge them. And then also, I was on a call recently with this call was with an organization that was predominantly African American, and we were talking about DEI and diversity. The DEI and diversity wasn't the primary focus of the conversation, but then this specific issue came up. How do we talk about diversity and inclusion within our community? Some of the challenges that we may have or individuals may have with people outside of our community. And so in addition to what you're saying, what we're talking about as far as, reading and connecting and being open and being intentional and, going to other people's events and rallies. I was on a call this morning with a person from another community, and she was asking for solidarity for others to come to her community, to her event, her community's event as well. So in addition to, reading, being open to connecting, but it's not that easy. So again, much like the CEO in the workplace, the leadership in these organizations, in these community organizations that are ethnic or faith-based or gender specific, need to also demonstrate the leadership in connecting with other organizations for solidarity, and also provide the leadership and creating the space for learning as well, I think.
Yeah, I think that's incredible. You touched on a really interesting point about not just like being able to show up and listen to whatever the community that you don't belong to has to say, but just like the collective power that we all have. If we are trying to move the rock uphill, I think it's just more, empowering to have others who are kind of like will benefit from the same fight, right? Or same effort. So
we have to get
kind of
beyond
leveraging each other.
Yeah, we have to get beyond this. We have to get beyond this mentality. And I like to, you may have heard this phrase before, having the key to the executive washroom. We have to get beyond this mentality of that there's only one key, one space, one space in at the table for a community or for your community. Many organizations, many companies, when you're looking at the C-suite, typically the diverse employee is the director of HR. It may be the director of marketing, but usually it's the one person. If it had to be one person, most organizations, the director of HR. Why is that? It does not have to be that one person. And then when you have that one space that may be, by a person of color from one group, then some people may be thinking that where are the other opportunities? So we need to create opportunities for more seats, for more keys in these spaces.
I want to actually ask about some mistakes that, common mistakes that companies make when it comes to DEI initiatives. And I understand that we're all kind of, there's, I think, maybe a societal impetus for companies to want to invest in this kind of effort. But what are some mistakes they've made, and how can we learn from them, and put those learnings into use?
I think not doing enough. I think companies make the mistake of not doing enough. They put the statement out and then they don't do the follow through, or they may think that one response to one community or one investment in one investment. I'm thinking specifically about a company that I work with that had this initiative that was specifically targeted to furthering inclusion of African Americans, but then they tried to do that with another community, and and I'm not going to go into detail, but the response was different and was received differently because they were not being specific, culturally specific, if you will. And so the mistake could be, depending on the company, thinking that one size fits all. So you have to be not just intentional, but also genuine and thinking through what all of those things could be. Other mistakes are thinking that the single unconscious bias training, inclusive leadership training, allyship training is enough. Knowing that this is a process, unconscious bias training is, it's an ongoing process for individuals, learning and unlearning and relearning all of these things that you've been taught and experienced. And so the company and the leadership, a mistake is that stopping there and not thinking through all of the many ways that they can do to further, not just in recruitment and retention within a company, but also what can they do in the communities of the employees where they live, and what can they do in communities where they operate, or what can they do, how can they be a better corporate citizen. So just thinking about the myriad ways that they can be involved. I think those are some of the, I think not just mistakes, but limited visioning, if you will, as
Yeah.
well.
Yeah. That makes sense. Well, you talked a lot about, reading and learning. Are there any resources, books, media, podcasts that you would recommend to our viewers?
Oh wow, I should have opened up my phone and had my list out. No,
Uh-huh.
we've seen, we've seen, we have Ibram X. Kendi's book. We have, let's see,
Mm-hmm.
I have what is this book? Superior by Angela Saini, called Superior: The Return of Race Science. There are a lot of books. There's Layla Saad's book, Me and White
Mm-hmm.
Supremacy. There are many books that that before, if I have a minute to think through, but there are many books. They're just,
Absolutely.
Google, um,
Yeah. Yeah.
if you have Kindle, there, if you start, putting one book in, a lot of books will pop up that are trending at the moment that one could find
Yeah.
as well.
One of my favorite podcasts is Code Switch. Have you listened to that podcast
I have,
before?
yes, I have.
Yeah. Yeah, I really like that one. I think I think the two hosts of those podcasts represent kind of like different perspectives and regions of racial identity in the U.S. So it's cool to get their perspective on things. Um, so let's kind of go back to DEI initiatives in the workplace. When, you know, oftentimes I think the people that are leading it are often the people that are, could benefit the most from DEI initiatives. So how do we ensure that they don't have burnout, they don't feel like they're the only ones who care about DEI initiatives in their company, like making sure that buy-in comes from across the organization? What are some, tips that you have for that?
Yeah, so that goes back to what you originally mentioned. We have these ERGs that are often led
Mm-hmm.
by individuals, and it's not fair. Sometimes it's fine
Yeah.
if an individual, volunteers that I want to take action. There's not enough. I know that I have experience to do more as it relates to diversity, and I want to, share my culture within the company, and create an inclusive space and be part of initiatives to address some of the HR issues of retention. But it's not fair. I think about some of these listening. Many companies were doing listening circles right after the killing of George Floyd,
Mm-hmm.
and a lot of African American employees were sharing, because even though companies were doing, for the last couple of decades, we know D&I initiatives began, 2 decades ago in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, and they were focused on on risk reduction. They were focused on diversifying the workplace, but they really weren't focused on inclusion and furthering equity. And so, even though a company may have experienced more diversity within the company, they were still missing the
Mm-hmm.
connection, the belonging, and that needed to exist. And so,
Mm-hmm.
when the killing of George Floyd happened, this created opportunities for companies to connect with Black employees, to understand, because this was shocking for many individuals. And but even though this was an important step in connection, it's definitely a burden. And so
Yeah.
it also created an opportunity for learning. So to return to your question, it goes back to making sure that these groups are not just led by representatives of the populations themselves, that there are other individuals, whether it's men, whether it's um, um, again, other people of other dimensions of diversity, participating in those meetings to further some of those initiatives,
Mm-hmm.
but which may mean working on recruitment and retention, or working on holidays, other ways of connecting and recognizing. I was in conversation with someone, and we were talking about just benefit plans, and how to, and just benefits, and the range of different, how benefits need to be customized for different employees, for
Mm-hmm.
different populations, based on, experience, based on not just demographics and experience, but also geography. If you're if you may experience, a lot of, if you're in a community where you have a lot of friends and family members who have maybe been impacted by community violence, you may be experiencing loss more than someone who may not be in a community that have friends and family that experience community violence. And what do benefits for that employee look like? Does it look like more time off? Does it look like more opportunities
Mm-hmm.
for counseling, or if you are another population that that needs additional time off for healthcare, what does that look like? And so definitely including people who are outside the community in these ERGs is important in order to further that within the company.
When, it sounds like communities have different needs, right? That's what I'm hearing. And the different needs should be, it's not one size fits all. So how does someone like an organization that's kind of rolling out policies, how do they keep it, fair and equitable, but still make sure that each community's needs are addressed? Is there kind of an approach to that kind of rollout or, attention that's needed?
Yeah. Yeah, I think that HR directors need to first, of course, make sure that everything is aligned with EEOC policies.
Mm-hmm.
But then also you want to make sure that I think that we're moving towards this in the workplace. As we're moving towards many companies are considering more of a remote work environment or hybrid environments. I think this generation of employees, as the workforce is changing, is demanding. They are demanding
Mm-hmm.
that we rethink what benefits look like in addition to other things. And so I think that in addition to making sure that we're being responsive to communities, but we're also being responsive to individuals, because as we know, we're sort of talking about DEI and different communities. I'm
Mm-hmm.
sure the people who are listening are thinking, well, yeah, there are communities, but within communities are individuals, and individuals have
Yeah.
different experiences. Sometimes an individual's experience, may be similar to another person's individual experience from another community, because we all live intersectional lives and we all have
Right.
intersectional experiences as well. So it's difficult to say that we should look at specific benefits for a community, but acknowledge that communities have different, some communities have different holidays, whether it's national holidays or religious holidays, but making sure that if we want to create an inclusive environment that supports belonging, that people can bring their whole self to the workplace, that we want to celebrate the
Mm-hmm.
experiences of all of our employees, and follow that up with whether it means they're able to take the day off, or they are able to be compensated, not just with a holiday or other types of support for their individual experience or their community experience.
Yeah, I think that's really good advice. When we talk about like recruitment, for example, especially within a small organization where you're really reliant on maybe your network or your reach, how do you attract and recruit people of diverse backgrounds?
Well, stop being reliant on your network. I mean, or expand your network. Expand your network. Don't only rely on the network, because many people are outside of the network. Many people are just aren't there, and all of the people. It's tricky because even in this space, we are trying to attract more diverse employees, and many companies are going to diverse organizations and HBCUs and other entities. One of the things that I think is also a good strategy, I think it's effective, is that when you get resumes, whether you market on specific, search engines or job search engines and things like that, when you get your resumes, to do, blind resume review. The HR person gets the
Mm-hmm.
resume, remove the name and review the resumes that way. I think that will help to reduce some of the biases, because even though we're trying to not just, we're trying to expand our network, we're still looking at the resume as, as an individual, and we're still going through in our mind. And even though we may say, we're not, whether you're saying you want
Right.
to hire a diverse employee or not, you're still reviewing that resume with that bias. And even maybe I
Mm-hmm.
would even go so far as to remove not just the name, but also the name and the school.
Okay. Yeah. I think that's really good feedback. I've heard of people doing that, implementing that, especially when they look at their metrics of who they're hiring and, how often do they hire one particular group versus another. Um, you know, because DEI is such a hot topic right now, and I think everyone kind of wants to, I mean, put it on a list and check it off. almost, especially kind of like the larger organizations feel some kind of pressure to do that. How do we make sure that organizations are not only like, talking the talk, but walking the walk? What kind of accountability can we put in place? Whether you're in the organization, or just even in leadership.
I think we need to measure it. One of the things that we talk about at Konesens Development is we use an acrostic for equity, and we're talking about furthering equity, throughout the organization. And I'm just going to quickly go through this acrostic. If I had it up on the screen, equity, EQUITY. So the E would be economics. It needs to be focused. Any type of initiative to further equity in a company needs to make sure that it's moving the needle in pay, in compensation, in furthering economic development. Q would be measurement. Q meaning quantitative, qualitative. We use that for measurement. U meaning uniformity, that it furthers fairness, it furthers justice. I meaning that it's inclusive. It's inclusive of the end user. It's inclusive of diverse voices. T, that is transformational, that it is transparent. And then Y, that it's why we use the word youth, not necessarily meaning that young people need to be involved, but that it's forward thinking. So when you mention specifically, how can we make sure that our initiatives, that leadership, and that organizations are held accountable? When I think about an equity initiative, we start by setting the benchmark. We start by doing, many companies are implementing DEI initiatives. They are doing their unconscious bias training. They're bringing in speakers, which are great. They're set up the ARGs. But I can't tell you how many companies I've spoken with and have worked with that have done these things, but have not done the baseline survey in the beginning to measure, the changed behavior, the changed understanding, to measure, to look at the statistics as it relates to their hiring as a result of this training and things like that. So I think that beginning with surveying, at the beginning or somewhere, begin the process of surveying your employees and whatever initiative that you're implementing, and then, following up and making sure that some type of change is occurring. I think that's one way of measuring accountability.
I really like your equity acronym. I'll have to, capture that at a later time to make sure that we circulate it. That's great. I really like it. I want to respect kind of the effort that DEI has done over the last 20, 30 years. When you think about the future, and not even like an idealized state, but what would be move the needle forward? What does a better environment look like, better opportunity look like in the DEI space?
Well, I hopefully, the DEI space is not a DEI space 20 years from now, that the next generation, that
snap
exactly, exactly. And maybe I'm being too optimistic and idealistic about the current, the current and the upcoming generations. I'm so inspired by the pushback and the transformation of the workforce, the environment that the new generation has inspired. As someone from an older generation, it took a minute for me to even adjust. What? We want more flexible work schedules. I'm so used to working, 18 hours a day. Work-life balance, what does that mean? But I welcome that. And hopefully, when we're talking about, I think about my son. I have an 18-year-old son, and we talk about DEI, and even still, he's experiencing his own life, and people receive him, but at the same time, his worldview is different than my worldview. His experiences growing up are different than my experiences, growing up. And hopefully there will, of course, 20 years from now, I'm not going to be, Pollyanna about it. I know that there will be some work, but hopefully DEI is that we're really entrenched in the E part. I think companies have, back in the 70s, the 80s, focused on diversity. We started talking about inclusion and belonging. And so companies right now are really intentional about creating spaces for belonging. The ERGs are examples of that. We're not there yet with the equity piece. And I think hopefully 20 years from now, 10 years, 20 years from now, that companies are really focused on the equity piece. What we saw as a result of the pandemic and followed by the killing of George Floyd, we saw the inequities, we saw the disparities. And for people who are in communities that experience the coronavirus disproportionately, and people who work with them in nonprofit organizations, this was no surprise. It was no surprise that we saw disparities in hospitalizations and deaths. It wasn't any surprise that even what we saw with George Floyd was not a surprise for many people from communities that experienced this. However, the pandemic and the killing of George Floyd, it shone a light on this. It shone a light on the inequities that exist. And so now we're at a space, we're at this reckoning, in the United States and in many companies, that we have to do something. We're at a moment right now where we're thinking we have to do something. We have to further equity. Right now, many companies don't know how to do that. And that's why we're thinking through that right now. My hope that 20 years from now, in the future of DEI, that we would have, addressed some of these issues.
Yeah, I think you're right about the generational difference. Even within the generational difference that I see, as a millennial looking at Gen Z and the kind of just boldness that they have about the kind of requests they have in terms of what's appropriate, what they're willing to tolerate and intolerate. It is inspiring. I think it's cool to see as the progressions of the generations that just we are demanding more and more that our society be better. I think that is definitely a step in the right direction. And I have high hopes for, where we're headed.
Yeah. And, I'm a Gen Xer and I thought we were cool back then. But no, and progressive and all of that.
Gen Z is I'd love this conversation so much. I want to give an opportunity for you to talk about something that I haven't asked you about yet. Is there anything that you think our listeners could benefit from as they're thinking about DEI for their organization?
Yeah, I think companies, small and large, I think that we're still short-sighted. And it's not that, and I shouldn't say short-sighted, we're doing what we can with the resources that we have. We're tackling what we can in stages. I'm going to say we're focusing on stages. So right now, a lot of the focus is on recruitment and retention, which is absolutely necessary. When people, we're looking around and they may have a diverse workforce, but they see that their C-suite is still, very anemic when it comes to people of color. So they're focusing on the recruitment and they're focusing on the retention. But again, I don't see, or with the smaller companies, the focus is on unconscious bias training now, or they're trying, to roll out unconscious bias training for the leadership and then roll it out to the rest of the teams because we're individuals. And I say this because even though there are still some differences, the reality is there are some differences between the large companies, which are public companies, which may have to do this because of the diverse shareholders. And so they have the diversity and inclusion expert and staff member who is pushing DEI. But the smaller companies that are under 50 employees may not have to do these things. And so the companies may have, you may have a CEO who wants to get involved, wants to make sure that they have a workspace that is inclusive. But then, we're all individuals who make up companies. And so it's important. And it's important that we help each other along. That's something that we haven't talked about yet. We're not all at the same place. All of us as individuals are different places when it comes to DEI. All of us have different understandings of DEI. I mean, we can turn to, some news channels and see the diversity understanding in things that have been misunderstood. I'm not gonna say the words. But there are different understandings, and some of the misunderstandings are in our family. Our family members have some of these misunderstandings. Our neighbors have some of these misunderstandings. Some of our coworkers have these misunderstandings, and we don't talk about them at work as well. Back to the HR director being the social justice, leader within the company. So I guess we just have to find ways to be inclusive of everybody and where everyone is at and help everyone along wherever they're at. So yeah, we have to have real conversations. I think about, diversity trainings that I've done where the CEO started out saying, we want to do something, we want to address anti-Black racism, within our company and within our sector. We want you to focus, these trainings on anti-Black racism. And then the training shifted because one employee or two employees felt uncomfortable. They felt like they didn't want to feel, targeted. They did really. And so the training itself changed. So, companies and leadership have to stay the course, but at the same time, make the individuals within the companies also feel included and help them to feel vulnerable and help all of us to feel vulnerable and help all of us to provide grace within the work environment. I know I've said a lot there. I said like 5 different nuggets, but but the main thing is that
they're all related and super important. So
yes, the main thing that I was trying to say is that we're all individuals in companies. The companies are not monolith, just like communities are not monolith. We're all individuals, and that we're all in different stages of understanding DEI.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Harriet. This conversation was really interesting. And it's interesting to be in this space where, 2 people of color can sit and talk about it at a lens that I think can be beneficial for everyone.
Thank you. I had a wonderful time having this conversation with you.
Great. Thank you so much. Whatever information you want to give us in terms of books or podcasts, feel free to pass that along. We'll pass that to our network as well.
Thank you. I should have had a list. I'll create a Harriet's list.
Oh, great. Perfect. Looking forward to Harriet's list. Next week, we will have a new episode on wellness practices for the workplace. Katie Bellamy will be on. She's a therapist, recovery coach, and a Reiki practitioner. We're going to go through movement and breath work and all how it will impact your ability to show up at work. Thank you so much for watching Navigating Now. We are live every Thursday at 3 p.m. Until then, bye.